slideshow as well. All right, can you see that all right?
Looks good.
All right. Yeah, so my name is Jim Lambert. I am an enterprise agile transformation lead with CapTech Consulting right now. I've been doing large scale agile transformations for just about 6 years. Before that, I led several different software development organizations in multiple different industries. So just about 30 years in the technology space, but there's really been a consistent theme of modernization, transformation, changing the ways of working has really been a big part of that entire 30-year period. But when we have something that's really agile at scale, so for a lot of us, when we get into these types of changes, we know it's always so much more than just quote unquote agile. We know there's a lot of changes that have to go in besides just what would fall under the agile header, a lot of technology, a lot of behavioral and mindset changes. So as part of what I've been doing with CapTech over the last few years is we started to blend some of our different skill sets, and I started to put together what we were calling a modern delivery transformation service offering. And that pulled together some of our agile experts, some of our organizational change management folks, some of our DevOps technical folks. And as we pull that together and we're doing some research into how to better help our clients be successful, it really led to some interesting and, in a way, some disturbing research, if you will. So what really was a theme when we were digging into this was just how much failure there is in these types of initiatives. Really, any type of modernization or transformation for several years now, success is really the exception by far. And the research is pretty consistent over that same time frame. So like I can throw some numbers out for you. The Everest Group a couple of years back said about 78% of these types of programs fall short of their objectives or fail outright. McKinsey has said 70% will fail. Global research from Advanced was saying 74% of legacy modernization gets started but never completed. So you go across all these different industry reviews, and it's really consistent. 70 to 80% of these programs are failing and getting little or no return on this amount of investment. So 3 out of 4 programs is really what we're talking about here. And when you look at that in terms of the dollars, that's absolutely massive losses for these companies. So in 2019, when we were first looking at some of these numbers and pulling this research together, the Harvard Business Review had said that there was an estimated $1.3 trillion spent on modernization and transformation initiatives, and almost 900 billion of that was wasted because of that failure rate. So we started to dig into a little bit more about, why is that so consistent year over year, such significant failure, so much money lost, and yet so many organizations still going after it with no better hopes of success, or they think that they'll be different. And so underpinning a lot of these initiatives is what most of us know, that kind of mantra of people, process, and technology. They think if they can handle all of these, then that will create that success. Oftentimes, though, they skew to one or the other of the three. If it's led by technology, they oftentimes will be looking more at the technical aspects, the new systems, kind of the shiny new object. We know if it's led more by a process orientation, like a lot of times when we're brought in to do Agile or Agile at scale, it oftentimes kind of skews to the process side of things. But then what you see in a lot of the research out there too is that the people part of it is really coming to the forefront. But over this same time frame, even though people are talking about people, process, technology, trying to get a balance there, what is really happening in that people space is it's consistently more about what people do, not necessarily who they are. So when I started digging into this a little bit more, it really started to become more about the key unlock for a lot of these was getting into what people actually think, feel, and believe, where they are today versus what they think about this whole entire initiative. It's what's happening inside of their heads that oftentimes gets kind of brushed over because it's the hard part. It's the really difficult part to get into that piece. So by not getting into there, we see this consistent type of failure. And I always got to throw a Yoda plug in there because I always think of that scene in Empire Strikes Back. You know, they don't believe it. Like, yeah, that's why you fail. So about a year and a half ago, and coincidentally, I was just doing some personal research on integral theory by Ken Wilber. And for anybody that's not familiar with Ken Wilber's works, what he was really doing from a more of a philosophical standpoint was trying to unify some maturity models, some progression across things that a lot of us are really familiar with, and they come across in our Agile work pretty consistently. So when we see things like spiral dynamics or memetics or some of the things that even we know from Maslow's hierarchy of needs, he's really pulling all of these things together. And what he was highlighting was to make that progression and move people to a new level of maturity, that there's this quadrant type model that's out there. So you look at what we have here is there's things that are internal to someone on the left side. What is it that we said they think, feel, and believe? What's happening inside of them? Versus on the right, you can see things that are more tangible, things you can see, feel, this, and the empirical evidence with the senses. So by pulling these two things together in terms of applying that thought for digital modernization and transformation, it kind of was a little bit of an epiphany for me that this model could be applied in this specific case. So this is what led to the finding the missing pieces. As I started to really do some deep research into some of these areas and look at how can we apply that type of integral theory to improve our successes for modernization and transformation efforts. So by taking that kind of quadrant model, you can look at different aspects of what you're trying to assess and what you're trying to mature. So you look at that personal quadrant of the individual internal. You can look at more of that cultural piece of what is that collective way of thinking and behaving. And then you can look at the things that people actually do. What's the things that they employ to do their jobs in an individual state? But then you can also look at that across the entire organization. What is it that's more common policies, procedures? So you get that collective versus individual type of dynamic that you really can bring that full type of assessment into. So one of the things that this starts to drive toward is that there's a progression. So even if you look at it from an integral theory perspective, one of the things that it's based on is not only progression of individuals and psychology, but also human evolution, how we've gone through different stages over a longer period of time, and they reflect each other very much. So if you look at this quadrant model as starting from the axis in the middle, in all of these different areas, you can mature and grow it further away. But what often happens is there becomes an imbalance there. So if you look at the stages that different entities go through, whether it's an individual or a company or a team, and then you start at the kind of the bottom of this maturity model and this flow, there are things that you still see some of these behaviors in some of the organizations that we work with. There are folks that are much more kind of in that survival mode. They're dominant. You see that alpha male type behavior. But then as you start to get a little bit more progressive into some organizations like government agencies start to become really rigid and conformist, and they start building little identities around roles and responsibilities, that starts to progress into this confident stage. But it creates this environment of us versus them. And we see this a lot in how folks in companies, as we go try to mature them from an agile standpoint, they still have a very distinct difference between what's the business and what's IT. So that's the kind of behavior you see at that stage. Most organizations in today's world are very much profit driven. So this confident stage is where you see this model of really leaning on expertise and data analysis. Everything is profit driven, shareholder driven, EBITDA for a lot of organizations. That's where the overall organization will set their decision-making process. But as we try to do agile at a lot of these organizations, what we're trying to do is move them into things that are much more around this purposeful state. Do we move from projects to products? Do we get more of customer centricity? What are we doing for employee engagement? How do we do high performing teams? There's a lot more of this people aspect that we talk about in that people, process, and technology that really has to come to light. And this is where organizations struggle to make that maturity shift. Now, there are things that can go further up the chain. And for anybody that's seen things like Frederick Laloux's organizational model, where he goes up to teal organizations, and there's a few of those out there, you know, the Patagonias of the world, that are moving up towards more of a transparent and intuitive. They kind of adapt their purposes as they go. So you have this more forward-thinking maturity model where people can aspire to. But most of what we are trying to do when we're doing Agile at scale is make that shift from confident to purposeful. Now, the model that is broken down in finding the missing pieces takes those to one more level of detail. There's 5 different aspects where you can look at the maturity. There are things around the values, whether that's what people believe individually or as a team, kind of what is that value system across the organization. It really drives that type of behavior. Now, the values that might be written on the wall aren't always what really happens. So we have to look at what's really the true behavior and the thinking out there. And again, it's internal to what these folks think and how they behave when they're together, which also drives a little bit more of this needs and identity type piece. What do they think they need? Who do they want to be? That drives a lot of some of the, like when you're in the us versus them type scenario, you really get kind of those battle lines drawn because that's the way they're thinking. That's who they think they need to be, and we want to move them forward. Now, you can start to add the process and technology pieces into this to kind of round out that true 4-quadrant people, process, and technology model, because they still need these pieces to align with where we want to take them behaviorally. How do we want to shift that mindset? Do the processes and the skills and the cross-functionality that we want to do they all support and balance out with how we're moving these folks along? And another piece that we typically run into is that the rewards and recognition are something that oftentimes gets left out. Are we incenting the right behavior, or are we still incenting things that drive the anti-patterns from an Agile point of view? So if you look at these as different developmental lines that might go across each part of that 4-quadrant model, you can kind of represent it as a grid like this. So starting at the bottom, which, you don't see a lot of organizations or people or teams still behaving this way. It's a little more like mafia, street gang type people that still kind of live that in their existence. But we know that you have to pass through those as a human developmental model to get to the point where you can do these higher order functions. So along the bottom, you can see where folks might be concerned about themselves, about how do they represent and hold power. The processes that we see in that type of model are very much ad hoc, fly by the seat of your pants, use the technology that's available. The way that people are recognized and rewarded is totally based on loyalty, or they actually don't even do that. It's just totally driven by the dominant factor. But then as you move up the chain, we get into more group oriented, how strictly compliant are they around their processes, moving up to that confidence stage where we're driven by profit and achievement. Now, this is where, when we're doing Agile, it also runs into a pretty consistent theme of they're working in a project orientation. Things are being done still by identifying cost, time, and scope. And then we are trying to be Agile within that. You get a lot of that, waterfall, Agile delivery, waterfall on the back end of the process. And so we don't really get to realize or unleash the power of agility until you break through and kind of move from that project to product mindset. Are we doing things that are more evolutionary, adaptive, emergent? For anybody that's familiar with the Kneffen model, software development is inherently in that complex quadrant where you have to probe and experiment and your solutions are emergent. That's where Scrum is based in empirical evidence. We know when we see it, when we do a demo or a sprint review or something like that, that we know if we're on track or we need to adjust or adapt. All of the underpinnings of agility start to truly show themselves as we move up into this purposeful level and try to go beyond. So if we go into organizations and look at an individual or a team of teams, a train, or within the organization overall, you can use this model to give a baseline assessment of where are we. It actually can turn into something that looks more of a bar chart. So in the values and understanding, maybe we're up here at the purposeful place, but our processes are really down around this rigid compliance. So it gives us an idea of how do we want to tackle the issues that exist in the current state and move forward and really start to set kind of a transformation backlog. How do we start to move specific areas, whether it's internal or external type pieces, to get that maturity really balanced out and move it forward? So what it really comes down to is oftentimes these things are very much out of balance. So if you take those 5 developmental lines and see that whether it's internal and individual or collective or external, as we move away from the axis point of this maturity model, those things may be moving at different rates. How do we push those things forward? But also know what do we want as that future state? So I can use this type of model to represent anything that's a specific entity in that organization. It's kind of a nesting type model is the way you can think of this, in the same way that atoms come together to make molecules and then cells and then tissues and then organs and then a whole human system. The thinking behind this is that I could use this type of diagram to say, here's a representation of this particular individual and where they are on these developmental lines. I can also say, what does a team look like here? What does a team of teams look like? What does a particular process or technology? Roll that all the way up until I'm talking about the entire organization. So there's that, it's almost like Russian nesting dolls. Why do I keep layering out and doing these different levels of maturity to try to figure out where are my opportunities to be impactful in the short term and to do an incremental type maturity adjustment to really move them to what we want to accomplish is more of that overall agility across the entire organization. Both Agile delivery, software development practices, but also that business agility that ultimately has to be paired up with it. So what you can do is by looking, instead of the individual developmental lines on the left-hand side, you can take somewhat of an average approximation and plot it on this as well. This has been helpful. So I've been using this at some clients for the executive teams, and it's helped them visualize where they are out of balance and how they can help support some of these changes. For anybody that's worked on some agile transformation initiatives or tried to work it within their own organizations. We know there's always a struggle about the management team, the leadership team, either not participating. It's why a lot of agile transformations are not successful, is you aren't able to make it real for the folks that need to influence the environment. A lot of times the senior leadership or executives will know they want to be agile, but they kind of think that, it's a process, go send these teams to training, and then send them back out into the wild and we'll be agile. That kind of turns into use the terminology and go through the motions, but you're not really seeing that behavioral shift, the mindset shift that has to go with it. So by taking something like this, we can really, in a fairly simplistic fashion, have the right conversations with the right people that say, you know what, in a technology aspect, we are really moving forward. We're way ahead of the game. We've got everything on all the new technology. We're using cloud and API, and it's dynamic, but the people that are putting this together and the teams, they are still drawing battle lines. It's still business versus IT. So you could see in a diagram like this that box would be skewed. It's a little bit of what we see a lot in a spider radar type assessment model, but it still gives you the opportunity to say, before we want to move to whatever they think the next big thing is, let's pull everything up to get some balance in this area so that we can actually unlock the power of what we're trying to do. So maybe the first step is to get everybody up to that connected or confident stage, just so that we have a foundation on which to build. Then we can move to something that's a little more agile or a little more purpose driven, unlock the power of the high performing teams. Excuse me. But this is really the, excuse me, the basis for the model in the book is more specifics about how do I assess where we are on these developmental lines? How do I assess overall on this model? How can I apply it in different contexts? But it gives you a way to set your transformation roadmap, set your transformational initiatives, have the right conversations at the different levels with the right people, and really be intentional and deliberate about how you do this in an incremental fashion. Those same types of transformation and modernization initiatives, either whether they skew to one of the people, process, or technology, or they are just, they continually fail. This is an opportunity for us to actually increase that success percentage by using this to frame how we want to tackle that and be very complete about all the different aspects that go into it. So that's really kind of the background on the content of the book and how it came to be. So I did want to open up the floor just for questions or comments or some shared experiences that this might resonate with some of the folks that we have on the call today. And Ben, has there been anything in the chat also? If anybody wants to.
Someone was wondering, at Purposeful, there's a shift. There's two words, maturable something. Did you have a term, something like that?
Could you repeat that real quick? Just I want to make sure I answered the question.
Yeah, so just reading directly from it, at Purposeful, there is a shift. What did he call it? Two words, and I think I heard maturable something, and it's a great buzzword. And I guess maybe it was the name of a book. Yeah, because that type of shift that we are seeing from that confident to purposeful level is something that a lot of organizations aren't really able to get to until they really realize that it's not process oriented, that it's not technology oriented. If you lead with people first, and you'll see that a lot in the trends, in all the articles that are out there, customer centricity, but also the employee engagement and employee satisfaction.
Organizations that are moving simple terminology, like from human resources to people operations, there's a thread and a theme there about always looking at people first, as opposed to profits, expertise, analytics. You can still use that when you need to, but it's not the lead into it. So what ends up being the underpinnings of that is profit is not actually the goal. Profit is the result of what you do in the space.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I guess, was there a book that you referenced at any point earlier?
There are several books that actually go into this. So Ken Wilber has a couple of books that are around integral theory. There's also, if you look at the spiral dynamics, or I think Laloux's organizations, actually, I think I have a note back here. Frederick Laloux's book is called Reinventing Organizations. And that's the one that speaks to what he used kind of a rainbow spectrum. So you go up to a teal organization, and the examples in there are companies like Patagonia, where their purpose doesn't actually say anything about their business itself. It's more about kind of how are they saving the world. So that gives you some directionality on these types of maturity models and how organizations are applying that. But that is really related to what Ken Wilber's work is to tie all of these things together, and have all of these models kind of be reflected in this same type of 4-quadrant approach.
Got it. Thanks. So far, those are the only questions we had in the chat.
Yeah. So if people want to, ask some more questions or add to the conversation, they can feel free to jump in. But one of the things that has been kind of nice to see coming out of this is, as we been able to apply this at some of the organizations that we're working with. There's some Fortune 500 organizations that they have gone through these things a couple of times and struggled with it. They have been some of those cases where they've spent a lot of money and not seen the results. And company that I've been working with over the last few months, kind of at the C-level, excuse me, executives, when we brought this maturity model to them, it really did resonate well with them. So it allowed us to have the right conversations and talk about how, as we were implementing what was an Agile Center of Excellence for them and trying to do this across some of their e-commerce systems and doing things at scale, we were able to bring in other parts of the organization. So it wasn't just working with the chief digital officer or the CIO. We brought in HR. We brought in their organizational change management. We were doing shifts in all of these areas because they were bought into knowing that they had to do something much more complete to make it effective. Excuse me. Now, we've also we worked with some organizations in the past before we had an approach like this, and they were thinking of things very much from a project mindset and a process. They were, several of them were implementing scaled Agile framework, but thinking that the framework in itself was the goal. And so when you started to bring up some of the things that as Agilists know will actually allow them to make that mindset shift, really support the environment so that the teams could be successful in the way they want, they just weren't ready or willing to go there. And so when you relate this back to the type of maturity model that we're talking about here, you can see that they are operating in some of those quote unquote lower levels. They were much more about compliance and following the process instead of really looking at it from a more broad people first perspective. So they were working in some of that, connected and confident type mode. Um, but the interesting part when you look at this from like a human developmental perspective is it comes down to that you don't know what you don't know. So you can't really tell somebody to start thinking in a different way. And when we're doing Agile, and so many people say Agile is a mindset, until somebody has experienced it or had that epiphany that moves them on to a next level, we have to find ways to be able to allow them to act into that or create an environment in which they're immersed in something that will allow them to change the way they think, feel, and believe, so they can make that shift and help the overall organization progress. So this gives us a framework and a structure by which to say, all right, if a company, as an example, is already operating at the purposeful level, how can we replicate some of those things that start to get people into the habits and the ways of thinking and do that in a more incremental fashion? You can't just tell them to, because that creates resistance, because they actually don't have the experience or the knowledge as to what that truly means, because it's the internal part of it. I can do the process and they can go through the motions, but until I start to consciously get into their internal workings, win their hearts and minds, that's where we really start to unlock it. So you can use these types of things along with these developmental lines to start pushing people up to that next level and helping them get there. It's much more of a collaborative approach to building that knowledge, building that behavior, building that mindset, and relating it to ways to set that balance across developmental lines and stages. So other questions or comments?
Got one in the chat from Rami. What would you think is a good process to validate team values as it pertains to assessing the maturity level in a small organization? Think remote startup, virtual environment, especially considering how most, if not all, members have a range of experience from previous teams, startups that they've been on.
So one of the things that we have to do pretty often to assess teams like that, and now it is even more important in this remote type environment, is types of surveys or pulse surveys or questions that get to the aspect of, what are they truly thinking? What do they think the team values are, the team norms, or the company values? Do they align with what they are trying to accomplish? You can do that from an individual standpoint. You can do that from a team standpoint, and start to get a good picture of what's happening on that internal side. You can then compare that to what do you have in place in terms of processes and technologies, and even your types of collaboration support when you're talking about a team in that type of mode, especially, I think what I heard was this might be a startup example. Things are happening rapidly, but the way that we work as human beings is to do things habitually. And so what can we do to identify the way people are thinking, to then start to set some experiments out there to start to establish that new habit, that new way of thinking? It does take time. So once you get that baseline through that kind of combined internal and external assessment, do things incrementally, but give it time to take. A new habit takes at a minimum 21 days to be established, so that when you're under stress or in a rush, you don't fall back to that prior behavior. So you have to be very deliberate about helping everybody in that environment along and giving them the capability to stumble around a little bit while you move to that next step.
Makes sense, thanks. So Rami did respond that experimentation surely definitely seeing slowly that there's no one right solution and it truly takes time. So I think just kind of an agreement of your assessment there.
Yeah, and that's where this really is aligned. I had mentioned the Cynefin model before as kind of that sense making complexity science type thing. Is when we are doing this type of maturity progression, it is emergent. I mean, that's what we do as human beings, is you probe and experiment what works, what doesn't. It is inherently the process of evolution. It's not the strongest that survives. It's the one that can most readily adapt to change. So if we are helping people be more adaptable and less rigid and give them that support model in all these different areas, it allows us to do this in that type of emergent approach.
Okay. And then, yeah, there's more of a statement in the chat. I don't know if there's necessarily a question, but it looks like what is going up from Bill. It looks like what is going on and showing transforming organization change. We need a similar explanation of what's been going on for technical types to relate to what has happened in the past. Like stage one being business apps, and we were segmented with the number of groups. The next two are database driven and waterfall, then Agile manifesto and communications driven, and now this 4 stages.
Yeah, and that's something that you can see almost that same type of evolutionary progression in processes and technologies. Exactly. So the things that we've come from client server technologies to some of these monolithic architectures, things that organizations will cling on to it's a really solid proven technology, but then they end up being super expensive and spending a lot of money on it. As they drive towards some of these more flexible, integrated, more component-based solutions, it allows you to start setting yourself up for more agility in different areas. But you can't do that in one case and just progress the maturity of your technology without bringing the rest of the pieces along to really see the value out of it.
And Bill also suggests that the Cynefin has a similar stages view, maybe even the same number. Does that kind of jive with your understanding?
Sorry, say that again.
The Cynefin framework. I'm not sure. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
Okay. So he was saying that it has some similar stages. Do you see those same stages to some of the stuff you've described here?
There is, and that's where when you really have to take that pairing of excuse me, what's the current state versus what's the future state, so you know what context you're in. So that's part of what the Cynefin model really helps you identify what type of approach you want to take based on what you are. If it's something that is in the Cynefin model goes from a simple quadrant, or an obvious is what it's called sometimes, to a complicated, then to a complex. The simple is where we know that things are really something you can plan out. I know that every time I take these steps, I'm going to get the exact same result. And that's something that for anybody, there are applicable cases when like that, where you can take very much a waterfall driven, project driven approach. But as you start to get into something that there's multiple options and you need a little bit more expertise or analysis, that starts to shift into that complicated area. But it's still something that is predictable. You can pick one of those and it's kind of the best choice available given the context. It's when you get into this realm of unknown unknowns, which is typically where software development falls. You don't know. There's so many variables. You don't necessarily know what's going to happen. You cannot put a plan together and it will not hold. So you have to be able to adjust and adapt and inspect. It becomes much more of that probe and experiment. And that was at the beginnings of the Agile Manifesto. For those that know the history of that, for the failure rate of software development projects at the time, some thought leaders had gotten together at what they called the Lightweight Methods Conference,
and realized that some of the things that they had been doing, so the folks that had come up with Scrum and some of these other things that they had tried to reduce the risk of failure in their software development initiatives, it was the common values and principles that turned into the Agile Manifesto at that conference. And all of those came from how are we communicating? How are we probing and experimenting? How am I, doing things in short iterations so I can keep course correcting? It is that complex quadrant in the Cynefin model that reflects exactly what ended up being in the Agile Manifesto.
Makes sense, thanks. And then one other comment from Bill. I would call this fourth stage continuous organization innovation. And he also heard another person at MIT last night call it radical product thinking.
I like those.
And that's what we have in the chat so far. Anyone else with live questions? I guess I'll ask. So a lot of the transformation that you talk about is happening towards the bottoms, in kind of a bottom-up philosophy, I suppose. When you think of the executives that you're in front of, and maybe they're presented with data that they're disconnected from the ranks or they're not communicating effectively, what are some strategies that you make use of to work with the executive teams to not necessarily command things happen, but to influence and to become better at that?
What we've done in some cases is actually gone back to this breakdown and shown, we'll come in and do an assessment, for example, and say, all right, in this area of the organization or in these teams or on this platform, here's what we're seeing. And when you can highlight that imbalance and craft the conversation around how do we move this particular developmental line up to a level where it puts things more in balance, that is something that has been engaging to them because they almost see it as an objective unto itself. All right, how can I influence my organization or do my piece to move that up? So it is, you could even, put numerical values around the bar chart or something like that, which I typically tend not to do because people will focus in on making the number as opposed to actually changing the behavior. But it does really create good conversations because it takes them out of the mindset of, I'm going to tell my organization, to go to their training classes or to go put this technology in place, get this cloud implementation up and running. And it makes it more complete that they can say, oh, I'm not going to get my value out of this unless I also do this piece. So ultimately, you're driving these conversations to something that resonates with all of these executives is that return on investment. If I am ultimately at a threat of not being successful, even though I've driven my maturity on technology or on process, if I don't handle these things, it's a house of cards and the whole thing falls down and I lose my money. And so that is as long as you can start pulling it back to this is how you make your investment get some type of return and some type of value, those conversations can underpin this entire type of assessment and set of conversations.
Makes sense, thanks. Did you have other content you wanted to get through or just kind of an open Q&A?
No, I just wanted to leave this type of time at the end just to see how it resonates with people, see what types of comments or questions they might have. And then, yeah, the other part is that for anybody that might go out and dig a little bit more into this, I like to make myself available through LinkedIn or anything like that. If anybody wants to reach out and have some more conversations or ask some more probing questions, I love having those types of interactions. So
Excellent. Yeah, we got about 10 minutes. So anyone have any additional questions? So yeah, Lee writes, he just thanks Jim and makes a lot of sense. And he likes the thinking frame for the individuals in the organization, and book ordered. So,
Thank you.
and another thank you from Mona as well. Said that this is a very informative session. I guess I have one final parting question then myself. So when you look at all of these different lines here, from values all the way down to rewards and recognition, do you find any one of these that moves the needle more than any of the others?
That's actually a really good question, because what we see is the focus typically falls on what is easy to see and change, which is the process and the skills and technology. But the one that really starts to move the needle the most is that top one on the values. Because when you get out of the way that you progress through the maturity levels, you look at yourself at the surviving level, then you look at outside to your team or your tribe or your group at the connected level, at the second level, but then you look inward again at the confident, expertise, analytics, that type of individual recognition. When you move back out and your values go to customers and people, and you start to really establish that as a mantra across your organization, across your teams, where you're focused, and you align the other pieces around that set of values and principles, that's when you can start to see things click. So if you put a concerted effort around moving that developmental line up, or setting an environment in which people can get there themselves more readily and easily, then that really unlocks the power.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that that definitely makes sense. Any other questions?
This is Tori. Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So I guess I'm curious on, like, what's your thought leadership in terms of, like, directly with, like, HR and, like, people managers, right? Because I think in many ways, right, like, the statistics about modernization initiatives failing is not really surprising, right? It's like no different than, like, renovating your house. I'm pretty sure 90% of those go over budget because it's just harder to do stuff, right, like, that way. And so versus if you actually, like, be a bit more intentional, right, about, like, who you're bringing to your organization. So for example, as you go through some of these things, if you actually look at, like, job profiles, most of that stuff isn't there, right? There, companies are hiring people based on a perceived skill set or competency, not necessarily for, like, cultural fit and aptitude. And so I guess I'm curious, like, how do you see this change, right? Like, as a front end thing, is it kind of, this never ending cycle? Like, I guess I'm kind of curious on, like, I guess in general, just kind of what your thoughts are.
Yeah, and actually that's a really good point, because we do need that HR participation when we're trying to implement Agile or do this type of maturity progression or do any modernization or transformation. Because if they are still, from an HR perspective, being that really risk averse type of group, and everything's really structured, and they're looking more about, not having any lawsuits or anything like that, they are operating at a different level of maturity that is not enabling the organization. So we will engage HR representatives to say, here's the types of roles that we're trying to put in place in this type of change.
And here's where we need the support. And here's where it needs to change a little bit from that heavy structure or chart hierarchy to let's add some things around culture and team behaviors. And do we also have that starts to leak into that rewards and recognition piece? So by bringing them into the conversation, you really start to get some influence on some things that will change the environment in which we want to make some of these transformation and modernization things happen. What we've done in several cases is get them to not only add some new types of job descriptions or change the way they write it, but we present to the HR organization about the things that we're doing and focus on things like the high performing teams part of it. How do we start to drive some of what, if any of you are familiar with that, Daniel Pink, what motivates us, that purpose, autonomy, and mastery? Those types of conversations are embedded in these maturity levels as well. So you get HR engaged by saying, how do we influence and grow our people? And how do we change the management structure and processes and reward structures to help enable that as well? So they do definitely have to be a part of it. And this gives you the same type of framework by which you can frame that conversation for that part of the organization to drive some of that maturity.
Excellent. I guess we've got time for one more question. Anything else that folks want to cover? Well, I guess we can wrap on, we had one more comment from Bill in the chat. Since this is a disruption, but no one realizes it, they use the current regime at the time, but since the ecosystem is morphing into something different, their estimates are not adding the understanding that this is a restructuring. So I think that's a pretty good note to end on it. Jim, was there anything, contact information or anything you wanted to put here at the end?
No, you can just look me up on LinkedIn, and
okay.
It's the tagline on LinkedIn for me is Lean Agile Leader.
Excellent. Well, sounds good. So yeah, I think we'll wrap up since we're approaching the top of the hour. Jim, I wanted to thank you for the time you took with us today, and we'll reach out and see if we can get the slide deck shared out. The recording will also be eventually posted to our Agile Austin YouTube channel. So it'll be available through all of those means. So yeah, thanks again for everyone attending as well. And yeah, good luck on your flight, Jim.
Thank you. And I appreciate the time. Thank you all, and enjoy your holidays.
Thanks.